I don't think there's anything I don't think there's anything else to say about me as far as disclosures. But I will say sort of what motivated me to get into this area because for a lot of my career, I was really focused on evidence-based practice. Everything I did was related to EBP and research and all that stuff. And over the last 2 years, I really switched a lot more into employment and wage stuff in our field, mostly because I employ a whole bunch of SLPs. The Informed SLP is a team of about 60 people right now, SLPs and PhDs who all work together. And once I started to become an employer and had to, consult with attorneys and HR people and accountants and stuff, and started to really understand what it was like to like write contracts and give people raises and how all of that stuff worked, I started to get kind of frustrated with how I was seeing SLPs being treated in our field and started to kind of like shift toward deep diving into like employment stuff in our field. So I am not an attorney. I am not an accountant. I am not a tax professional, but I've worked really closely with all of them. And there will be a few things in here that I share with you that were like developed by an accountant or developed by an HR attorney. So I won't go too far past my area of expertise. All right, so let's get started. Let me kind of move this over because I'm sure like I want to be able to like see your faces and see the slides clearly. Um, this is kind of what job posts look like in our field. And I want you all to look at these two, and I'll give you, I'll stop talking for just a minute or two so that you can read and think. And I'm curious if you were somebody who was on the job market in Kansas City, and I use Kansas City as all the examples because I'm familiar with it because that's where I live. Which of these jobs is more enticing to you? What do you notice about the difference between the two of them? What do you notice about the differences in pay? Like which one do you think is better? And then I'll ask you some questions about it after you've read them both. Okay. So we've got a couple people saying they feel like A is the better job. Yep. And with a combination, I know that we have a combination of students in here and people who've been in the field for 10 plus years. And the people who've been in the field 10 plus years are probably going to be the ones that are like right out the gate getting a lot of these questions correct. And so if any of you students feel kind of like confused by this, we'll go through it. Don't worry. All right. So everybody's saying A. Um, Hillary's saying B because I've worked salary before and ended up making less per hour than I did when I was hourly. Yeah. Those of you who like A, why do you like it?
I like the 401k matching.
Yeah, the 401k matching is nice. And like the benefits in general, people are saying, like, I like the benefits. I like that there's PTO. I like that all that is there. Some people are saying, I like that the salary is stated. Yeah. And yeah, Lydia's right. It has a lot more specific information. It's less like marketing language, like, top pay, max flexibility, and instead tells you kind of the stuff that you need to know. So let's attempt to actually compare them. So, like, we're kind of working on vibes here. Like, A feels right because it's giving us more information, B is withholding more information, but let's try to go further than that. So, right now, A is on an annual pay scale, right? 60 to $72,000 a year, whereas B is on an hourly pay scale. Let's see if we can get them comparable to each other so we can actually judge which one pays more or less. So starting with A, and let's just assume that you're like brand new on the job market. Let's assume you're a CF and we'll use the lowest numbers on these. So we'll just assume that you're coming into this job making 60K. Okay, just to make the math a lot simpler. So if you're making $60,000 per year working full time, what are you making hourly? And I'm asking you this question without teaching you how to do it, but I will teach you how to do it too. Don't worry. I just want to see if anybody can. Brilliant. Yep. Exactly. It's about 29 per hour. Now, there's a magic number that I'll teach you about later in this lecture that's 2080, that anytime you're trying to convert an annual pay to hourly, 2080 is the number of work hours that's assumed per year in all full-time jobs. So if you're working 40 hours a week, you're working 2080 hours per year. And all of the jobs databases like Indeed.com, ZipRecruiter, things like that, when you see them make annual to hourly conversions, or like the Bureau of Labor Statistics data, it's always 2080. So you can go from hourly to annual by multiplying by 2080, or annual to hourly by dividing by 2080. Okay, so if it's, 29 per hour, all right, so we've got that. What can you convert B to annual? Like from that job post, let's assume they bring you in at $50 per hour. What do you assume that you're going to be making per year? And you could just multiply 50 times 2080. That's not going to be right. But usually only people who have a lot of experience working jobs that look like B know that you're not actually paid full time. And we'll talk about that in a second. But like if you tried doing that, like if you, because this is a full-time position too, right? So can you take 50 and multiply it by 2080? What's that? $104,000. Okay, good. So what can end up happening is, especially if you're a new SLP on the job market, you're sitting at home, you're looking at these jobs, you're trying to run the calculations, and a lot of times people will assume that job B is going to pay you way more. But the SLPs that are in the room that have had jobs that look like this know that probably it's pay per visit, like direct time only work, where yes, you're paid $50 per hour, which is a nice solid wage, but you're only paid when you're in direct client contact. So doing therapy. So you're not paid for paperwork time, emails, phone calls, traveling between clients. And if your caseload isn't full, so if you have clients who cancel and you're not paid for cancellations, or if the census just at the clinic or wherever it is that you're working is kind of low and they don't have quite a high enough caseload for you, you won't be paid, right? And so the funky thing about this job B type profile, which is about half of the jobs in our field, is it is impossible to know how much you're going to make. So I wrote down my calculations for me so I didn't have to do any live math. But that job B could pay you anywhere between about $45,000 per year and $100,000 per year. And like Hillary in the chat said earlier, she's had a job before that looked like job B where she actually made a lot more. But you can also make a lot less. And that's the real funky thing about being on the job market for an SLP, is when I first started working, a lot more job announcements look like A. And over the years, I've seen more and more and more and more look like B, where almost no matter how long you've been in the field and no matter how much you have no idea what you're going to be paid in that job, which for a lot of people isn't okay. So that's one of the things that I'm going to be teaching you throughout this entire lecture, is how to figure it out and what questions you would have to ask the employer in order to know exactly how much you're going to be paid. Because, a lot of us didn't go into this field to be making $45,000 per year. Like that's not what we want, right? And we want to know, like we want to be able to predict our income, because that matters for a lot of people too, and so I'll teach you how to do that. All right, so I created these kind of schematics for you to visualize the difference between these two jobs. So a job like A, where they're quoting you a salary, there is no wiggle room in how much you're going to make in a year. They hire you for 60K, you're going to make 60K, unless they have all kinds of like other funky things too, like productivity bonuses or stuff like that, right? So what you could make in a given year is tight. Job B, what you could make in a given year is unpredictable. Usually what I see is job B is it tends to pay less than job A, because if they could have consistently hired you and afforded you and were able to afford hiring you for $60,000 a year, they would have just made it a salary position in the first place. But what those jobs do is they protect the employer in case they don't have enough money coming in the door to pay an SLP's salary. So they tend to be lower, but they can be higher. You can get paid like way more in those jobs. It's just unpredictable. All right. So let's go through some myths. So one myth is that SLP job posts will tell you how much you'll make per year, but the reality is most don't. And it takes a lot of reading between the lines in these job posts to know what questions to ask before you're going to be able to figure out take-home pay. Another myth in our field is that SLP pay is bad. Like you'll see this on Facebook and on Reddit and stuff like that. But the reality is it's bad if you're taking bad jobs, and there's a fair number of bad jobs out there. But SLPs are above the 80th percentile of earners in the US. And so we actually have pretty darn good jobs, and some of us have really good jobs. Like the key is just knowing how to push out the junk and grab the good ones when you're on the job market and in a jobs database. Another myth is that I can find average SLP pay rates by Googling it or asking ChatGPT. And no, that's a big no. And I'll show you why that doesn't work at all. But the funky thing is it does work for most jobs. Most jobs you can pop into ChatGPT and be like, what will I make as a school-based SLP, in this state? Or what will I make if I work at a hospital as an SLP in this state? And the information that it gives you will be accurate, not for our field, unfortunately. So what we're going to cover are a few topics: 1099 versus W-2, then pay norms, then pay calculations, and then kind of the future, like how to take all this information and carry it forward in order to move through the job market in a way that you're able to choose things that are good for you. Okay, so 1099 versus W-2. So these two words are critically important when you're on the job market, and when you have a job, because the way you're treated as both of these, and both of these are different. So W-2, we're using it as shorthand for an employee. Technically, W-2 is the tax form that you're issued as an employee. And then 1099 means contractor. And again, technically 1099 and contractor aren't really synonyms. 1099 is just the tax form that you're issued as a contractor. But I encourage people to always use the words W-2 or 1099. Like, am I going to be W-2 or 1099? Because what I've found over time is there's an unfortunate number of employers who do not know the difference. They will call all of their staff employees, but a lot of them are 1099s, or they'll refer to everybody as staff, and they'll basically use this employee staff contractor terminology in a really inconsistent way. So I would always use the terms W-2 and 1099 with people when you're talking to them about your jobs. Okay, so then what is the difference between W-2 and 1099? So I like to use the analogy of a house, where most people, when they think of a business and they think of the people who work with it, they think of the example on the left where everyone's an employee, or W-2. So within this situation, these W-2 employees are protected by the business and protected by laws that apply to employees. So they work inside the business. The person who's in charge of them is truly their boss. They are protected by any state or federal laws that apply to employment. And the business pays some of their taxes. Like really, they kind of sit inside the business and have a lot of both financial and legal protections sitting inside the business. Whereas a 1099 or a contractor is its own business. So I think this is a thing that a lot of SLPs don't realize, again, especially when they're like new to the field, is they'll take a 1099 role and not realize that, surprise, you're now a business owner. Like the way your money works, the way your job works, you are actually your own business owner as a full-time 1099 contractor. There's a lot of tax benefits to that. There's a lot of legal differences, and you really own your own business with only you sitting inside of it, and you're contracting with the business that you work for. And the reason that I like the house analogy, because I think it makes a lot of sense to people when you think about like if you own a home, and the people that come and work on your home are pretty much always contractors. So imagine that I have my house and I want to get the outside of my house painted because all the paint is peeling and it's looking terrible or whatever, right? So I go out and I find some painters and I sign a contract with them to come paint my house. So usually, not always, but for this situation, we can work with it. That painter is a contractor and we've entered a contract together, right? So what that painter is doing is coming to my house, painting the outside. And yes, I get to like tell them what to do for us to a certain extent. Like I'm like, I want you to, paint it this color. I want you to, like I want the shutters this color, blah, blah, blah. But for the most part, I'm not telling that painter how to do his job. I'm not like, you need to use this kind of ladder and these kind of paintbrushes. And I want you to start on the west side, not the east side, because I don't know, a control freak and have some opinions that, and I think that I'm the expert when he's the expert or whatever. But for the most part, like the contractual agreement is, hey, expert, I'm hiring you to do a thing. You're going to do this thing that I hired you to do, but only that thing, and you're the expert. So ways in which I could not treat that contractor is I couldn't say like, hey, Joe, I know I hired you to paint the outside of this house, but I've really been wanting to move this bed in our, in my daughter's room, but it's too heavy for me. Could you come move that bed for me? Like, that cannot happen because he's there only to paint the outside of my house. So like that would be out of his like scope of practice, right? But I also couldn't ask him to come in and do things like inside his scope of practice. Like I couldn't be like, hey, while you're here painting the outside of the house, could you actually paint my bathroom green too? Because I've really been wanting my bathroom to be painted green. And so like he has a clear contract of what he's here doing. He's the boss of him. Even though in some ways I'm the boss of him, I'm also not really the boss of him because I can't make him do things that aren't in his contract, and he gets to decide how he works. That is the 1099 SLP job. You are your own boss. You do only what's in your contract, and you do not have to like do other extra things just because like your boss asked you to. So these two jobs are very different. So like if I wanted to use an example of like a W-2 working at my house, that would be someone who was like an employee of my house. Say I was like some lady who had like an assistant that's my employee and they can do whatever I tell them to do. I'm like, hey, I need you to go to the grocery store today. I need you to do my laundry today. I need you to go pick up the kids. I need you to like clean up this. I need you to do that. Totally different roles. Okay. So, when we think about SLPs, a lot of businesses will have both W-2s and 1099s in the business. So they'll have a combination of employees and contractors, right? And my primary business, the Informed SLP, is that way. We have both employees and contractors. However, employees and contractors can never have the same job. So this is where a lot of employers will get it wrong, is they'll enter conversations with SLPs and they'll be like, do you want to be a W-2 or a 1099? That's not the way it works because these are actually completely different jobs. And if an SLP within one business, so if SLPs in a business, some of them are W-2 and some of them are 1099, if the only difference is what tax paperwork they're issued, it's illegal. Okay. So let's kind of get into this a little bit more. So now that we've worked through our like house analogy. So 1099 contractors, the three differences are behavioral, relationship, and financial. Because this lecture is mostly financial, I want to focus mostly on the financial differences. But I already talked to you about like some of the behavioral and relationship differences, like if we used our house and painter analogy. But for like extending those to SLPs, for example, if you are a 1099 contractor with a school district, there's a lot of things that you don't have to do that a W-2 employee of the school district would have to do. So for example, if you're a 1099 contractor and let's say on like a professional development day, the school is having a lecture about trauma-informed care, your supervisor can't make you go to that. And if they ask you to start going to some of those like meetings and trainings and stuff that's meant for all of the school employees, it actually like puts them at risk for legal misclassification of you. Okay. If you're a contractor at a school, they can't ask you to do bus duty. Whereas if you're an employee, they can ask you to do that. Okay. So like those behavioral and relationship things are actually really important because they drastically change how you operate. You can't tell a 1099 contractor how to do therapy or how to do evaluations. Like for the most part, they're supposed to be in charge of like getting the job done however they deem is best because they're the expert. Okay. And I know that like if this is a brand new concept to you where you've never heard the difference between these two things, you're going to be like, oh, like, how am I going to know all these differences? But everything that I'm talking about here, so this article, which you can click as a hyperlink on the Informed Jobs website, there's a whole article listing differences between 1099s and W-2s for SLP. And it's like a huge bullet pointed list where it's like, if you're a contractor, all these things will be true. If you're an employee, all these things will be true. So I'd encourage you to read that. Joan said, if the employer puts in the contract that the 1099 employee will do bus duty, can they do that? Yeah, they could. I don't usually see that in the contract, but they could, I guess so. Okay. So financial, let's kind of move away from the behavioral relationship and into the financial stuff. So financially, as a contractor, you'll be paying 7.65% of your annual pay in taxes above and beyond what you would be paying if you were a W-2. So this is where we start to get into the like situation where it's like, oh, it actually makes a huge difference to like my pay, the difference between 1099 and W-2, it does. So let's imagine, remember that job A that was $60,000? What's 7.65% of $60,000? I probably did the math at some point here, so I don't have to pull out my calculator. I'm sure one of you has a calculator on your phone too to do it. What's 60,000 times 0.0765? Because I didn't do that. 60,000 times 0.4590. That sounds right. I'll believe you, Dr. J. 4590. So $4,590 as a 1099, you're going to be paying more in taxes per year than if that exact same job was W-2. Why? Because for W-2s, employers are responsible for paying a portion of your taxes. So employers pay some, you pay some. But as a 1099, you're your own employer. So you pay 100% of the employment taxes, okay? So that's like thing number one, where it should be all right, if I'm taking a 1099 contract and I'm trying to compare apples to oranges here and it's not working out, I at least know that my 1099 job needs to pay more because of the taxes alone, right? Okay, so thing number two, you're also responsible as a 1099 for all of your own expenses. Employers cannot reimburse you for travel. They cannot reimburse you for job supplies. You're supposed to be paying for everything that you need in order to get the job done. If they start trying to give you like stipends or reimbursements and things like that, misclassification. You actually should be a W-2. You also cannot have benefits as a 1099. You don't get health insurance. You can't be on the company's 401k plan. None of this stuff. Again, if they try to give it to you, they're going to end up getting in legal trouble because you're misclassified. You should actually be a W-2 employee. Usually you also aren't paid when clients cancel unless you have a funky contract where it's like flat rate, which is more common if like you contract with the schools full time or something like that. But long story short, looking at all these different things, it is more expensive to you to be a contractor. So if you're trying to compare two jobs to each other, your hourly or monthly rate as a contractor should always be higher than W-2. So even if you don't like fully internalize all of this, just 1099s should pay more than W-2s, period, just because of these things. Okay. Employee, this is the job that most people think they're getting. So like when I see new grads out on the job market and they're applying for jobs and they take something, they almost always think that they're an employee, even if they're not. If you were an employee, you would be eligible for benefits. You would have labor law protections. Your boss would be your boss, all that type of stuff. Okay. Oh, did I skip one? All right. So, this question of, all right, so like, I get the difference now between 1099 versus W-2s. The next thing I want to know is like, how much money should I be making? Like, what's good pay when I'm looking at jobs? These are screenshots from Facebook that I just hopped on the other day and was easily able, you'll see that they're all like January, they're from last week because they're easy to find in about 2 seconds, because this is one of the most common questions I see SLPs posting on social media is like, how much should I be making? Is this good pay? So people are asking like, what's the highest paid setting? Or like, hey, I live in Utah. Those of you working with adults in these different settings, what kind of rates are you making? Or this one down here, like where it's like, what's an acceptable hourly rate for a hospital setting in Dallas, Texas? And people are asking these questions not because they don't know where to look, but because the data for this is kind of funky and all over the place. Um, so when we look at pay norms for our field, and I'll kind of like rewind a second and tell you a quick story. So I'll talk about informed jobs at the end, but basically what it is a jobs database where people can search for jobs, right? And I had this goal in mind where I was like, okay, we've got all this data available, the BLS data, the ASHA data, like we have to have good data on SLP wages, and I'll be able to go pull that data and use it to power the database. And when a job is posted, I'll be able to do things like, show whether or not it's like which quartile it's in. Like, is it a lower paying job, a higher paying job? I'll be able to link people to the data so that if they're like, oh, I'm in a hospital setting in Texas, how much should I be making per hour? And I'll be able to link them straight to that data and they'll be able to look at it. Once I started really digging into the data, I was flabbergasted at how bad it is and how nobody has talked about this before in our field that I've ever seen. And even publications like scientific journal articles that have been published in our field within the last couple years are using bad data and not realizing it. So once I show you guys how bad it is, you're going to be like, how did nobody notice this before? Because I didn't notice it until I started looking at it. But basically, the only reliable wage data that we have right now at all is ASHA's. ASHA didn't screw it up like everybody else did. So I have some links over here. I'll, bring them over. So if you're trying to look at ASHA's salary data, all you have to do is like Google ASHA salary data. It'll take you to a page that looks like this. You see on the left side is audiologists, on the right side is SLPs, and then notice how they do healthcare, schools, healthcare, and notice how it goes every other year. So this year, 2024, they'll post the 2024 data soon, but it'll be schools data again because they basically go every other year with schools and healthcare. So you would choose which data set to look at based on where you work. And so let's say you're like a school-based SLP and the 24 data isn't on the website yet. So you'll just go with 2022, close enough or whatever. You click on it, and it's this long, 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 long PDF with all of these different things. So it's broken down by setting, it's broken down by salary or hourly versus annual, it's broken down by state, it's broken down by like how many years you've been in the field. And you'll just sort of like find all the details that match you, whether or not you're a seasoned SLP or a newbie, where in the country you work, if you're working in a rural setting or an urban setting, all these different things, and in order to find like what you should be making. ASHA doesn't screw it up because ASHA understands how our jobs work, but nobody else seems to understand how our jobs work. Shocking, right? Like a lot of people don't even know what SLPs are. So every other website available, they mess it up, and I'll show you how they mess it up. So including the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is it's like federal employees, a bunch of economists that put this together. So you'd think they wouldn't mess it up, but our field is really unique. So they're making one of the following two errors, and basically everywhere else. They're either collapsing salaried roles with pay per visit roles and assuming that all salaried roles are 12-month contracts, or they're assuming that job posts equals pay norms. So I'm going to, in the next slides, I'm going to describe both error 1 and 2 to you so that you can know how to avoid it. All right, so in the Bureau of Labor Statistics data, which I'll pull over a link to what it looks like. So like if you were to Google SLP wages and you hit this US Bureau of Labor Statistics website, which should be a very trustworthy place to go, right? And a lot of the wage data online extracts from here because they assume that it's the most reliable. It's not. But here's the error that they're making. First thing is they assume that everybody works, if you have a full-time job that you're working January to December, you're working 12 months out of the year. Who in our field doesn't work 12 months? Schools. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And school-based SLPs are 60% of us. Okay. So when you have 12-month contracts mixed with 9 and sometimes 10-month contracts, that kind of messes things up a little bit. So that's like level 1 of screwing it up, is the fact that they don't realize that a lot of our contracts aren't year round. Level 2 is in these surveys, what they ask people is they say, do you work a full-time job? And the SLPs all say yes. And most of us do, right? Like most of us are working like 8 to 4, 9 to 5, 8:30 to 4:30, whatever. And most of us are working 8-hour days, Monday through Friday. Okay. However, that doesn't mean that we're paid for 8 hours Monday through Friday. A lot of us aren't actually paid for a 40-hour work week, even though we're working a 40-hour work week. Grad students are often like, what? You're working 40 hours, but you're not paid for 40 hours? And so here's how this works. So say you're working at a clinic and your schedule looks like this, where you arrive in the morning, you go and you get there at the same time every day, you go home at the same time every day. For all intents and purposes, you have a full-time job, just like every other person with a full-time job, right? And then you have a caseload that's filled up here. So you've got Jane, Jenny, Jackson, Josh, Jada, Joe, Jahir, a couple little gaps in there because you have a tiny little gap for lunch and a little gap to like, do admin stuff like emails and paperwork, blah, blah, blah. But here's the problem. Jenny is sick, and so she's gone for the day. Knock her off the schedule. And Jada's family is on vacation, so she's gone for the next 2 weeks. Knock her off the schedule. No big deal. These things happen all the time, right? But if this is a pay per visit job where you're only paid when you're seeing clients, it's very feasible for you to have days where you're there 8 hours and you're paid for like 4 or 5. And sometimes it's really variable. Sometimes you're there for 8 hours every single day. Some days you're paid for 3. Some days you're paid for 7.5. It is all over the place. Okay. And so while 8-hour workdays are the norm for us, we're only paid for certain parts of the day. So what happens with the survey data, like the BLS data, is they'll quiz SLPs and they'll say, are you paid hourly or annually? And the SLP will say, oh, I'm paid hourly. And they'll say, how much are you paid per hour? And the SLP says $50. And what they do is they do 50 times 2080, and they say, cool, you're paid $104,000 per year. Got it. But they don't like verify that with the SLP. They're not like, oh, is our math right? Did we do this right? They just assume that it's right because that's the way most jobs work. That is not the way our jobs work. Okay. So that's how the data gets all sorts of messed up. And so I refer to this as the 2080 rule, which is the assumption of a 2080 hours in a work year, which is like the standard assumption, especially for W-2 salaried roles. But this only applies to half of us or less. And so anytime you see wage data where the salary average equals 2080 times the hourly average, it's wrong. It's just wrong. Okay. So let's look at what that looks like with the BLS data. So if I pull it back over here, and again, this BLS data is what's in our journal articles. It's what's powering everything. It's like what ChatGPT pulls from. It's what Google pulls from. It's what reporters pull from. Okay. So let's look down at it. All right. So, and I think that the most illuminating one is to go by setting, because then you can start to really see why this is messed up. So elementary and secondary schools. So 40.25, they're saying is the hourly wage. 40.25 times 2080 is 83,720. And you can do the math. Like you can go through and do the math for all of these, and you'll start to realize that the hourly column and the annual column, it's always multiplied or divided by 2080. But we already know for school-based SLPs, that's just not right because you're not working 2080 hours per year, right? Sometimes though, these are almost right, and they're almost right kind of by coincidence. And what I mean by that is the school data is high, but not crazy high, mostly because all of the SLPs that are, for the most part, they're dumping school data in are dumping it in as annual. So they're saying, I'm paid 70 grand a year. I'm paid 75. I'm paid 85. And so these numbers make sense. And that is the same thing with what happens like with teachers. Like if teachers were to use the BLS data, they would mostly tell you that it's pretty doggone close to right, but it's right only because all the people dumping the data in are dumping it in as annual. And so when they look at the numbers, they just like, they kind of ignore the hourly part and they just look at the annual and they're like, that annual is pretty close, because the number of people who are dumping hourly data in isn't that high. The ones that are real funky are the ones where you have a combination of people dumping salary and pay per visit roles all in there together, like with home health, and then it really messes up like what the average looks like, because this annual average is not right. This hourly average is right. How is the hourly average right? Because a whole lot of people in home health are dumping their data in as pay per visit, like, or pay per visit if you assume that it's hourly. So all these numbers are wrong. They're all unusable because they're all divided by 2080. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah. Okay. All right. So, and I'll come back to those questions at the end. All right. So that's critical error number one, is the assumption that SLPs are paid for 2080 hours per year. It makes all of our wage data, other than ASHA's, because ASHA corrects for it appropriately. All the other wage data is wrong. Critical error number two is assuming that job posts are equal to hourly or annual averages. But so with these jobs posts, like let's use Indeed.com as an example, because that's a really common one that people will use. That same 2080 error carries over. So when an employer puts in a job and says, oh, $50 per hour, pay per visit, so direct time only, the jobs database will multiply that by 2080 to assume that you're making $104,000. And it's just a default assumption. Like it doesn't ask the employer, hey, so all right, so it's 50 per hour, pay per visit. They don't even have questions in their database to account for the fact that, like, hey, what are people actually making on average per year in this role? They just do the math for the employer and then dump it into those filters. The other thing, and I'll kind of like tell another little story with this, is employers are incentivized to list highs that don't represent averages. And they're also incentivized, honestly, to withhold disclosing pay anytime it's below average. I've had many conversations with private practice owners that are like, I can't put pay in my job post because then people wouldn't apply if they're paying anything below average. So that's a problem. But also, like, these job databases kind of push a lot of us toward listing higher pay than we really should. And here's how that works. So several years ago, I got onto Indeed.com because I was hiring for a writer for the Informed SLP, and I wanted to see what kind of like hits we could get if we posted like on Indeed in addition to like just posting on social media and stuff like that. And I also just wanted to see like what the process was like to get an Indeed job post up, right? And so I'm going through the process, and it's like, what are you paying? And I put in 50 per hour. And then I clicked next. And the software popped up a thing that said to me, did you know that a lot more people will view your job if you list it for $60 per hour? Would you like to adjust the range on this to make it 50 to 60? And they basically prompt you to increase the pay until it gets to the point at which they know that you're going to get a lot of hits on it. Why? Because that's how they make money. If you list a job post and don't get very many hits on it, like they're not going to make very much because they're paid based on how much traction your job post gets. Now, from an employer's perspective, when I was looking at that, I was, a lot of employers will sit there and think to themselves, well, I was planning on paying 50 per hour for this SLP writing job. But I mean, if somebody was really fantastic and had a lot of great expertise, like, I mean, I guess I would pay them 60 per hour. Like, sure, we can give that a try. So the employers will go ahead and proceed with doing it. They'll raise the upper limit on the range that they're willing to pay because they're thinking in their head, I guess in a rare situation, I would pay 60. But what they're still doing in their head is, I actually want to pay 50, right? Like, I want to pay 50, but sure, I'll write 50 to 60. And then they just go with it. And then what the jobs databases do is they assume the median and they assume that the high is actually accurate. Okay. And so it messes up the data. So I'm going to pull over what Indeed.com looks like. So if you go to a website, and you can do it in your area too, because I don't know if this is going to like hit right since you all aren't from Kansas City and you don't know what Kansas City norms are. But I think they're pretty similar to what you see throughout Louisiana. I would assume so. But basically, if you type in speech pathologist and then type in your city and hit search, okay, boop. Now, I want you to look at pay. So drop down this pay right here. Your options for filtering are all salaries, 70, 80, 85, 90, or 95 plus. Okay. So I live in Kansas City and I know what normal wages are. Normal wages in Kansas City, like on average, are like 70, 75. Okay. But what this is showing is it's making it look as though the average is maybe somewhere around here, around 85K, and it's making it look as though there's lots of jobs, 90 and 95 plus, and we'll even click on the 95 plus so I can show you what they look like. They're hourly jobs. Okay. So look at this 55 to 60 per hour. They're taking that 55 to 60, multiplying it by 2080, and assuming that you're going to make that kind of money. You're not. I don't know what communication station is. I'm sure it's a lovely place. I'm pretty sure it's a private practice. I know the private practices in our area aren't making over six or paying people over six figures. They just aren't. Okay. So it's just a total math error. Um, and so why does nobody notice this? Like, why does nobody care? Well, because our jobs are really weird, you guys. Like most people aren't paid per visit. And at most, and even like in some fields where like that might be the norm, our field is really split too, where we've got like 60% of people making an annual salary, 40% of people on these weird hourly and pay per visit jobs, right? And when you blend those together into wage data or a jobs database and don't differentiate the two, that's how you get all these real funky numbers that cannot be trusted. Okay. All right. So job posts. Ranges aren't averages. Okay. Pay listed is only loosely represents like the open job. The highs are often fake because incentivized and employers are incentivized to put unrealistic highs just to get more hits on their job. We looked at Indeed.com together. Here's another thing though. Okay, so moving away from like the like pay thing, with job posts, a lot of them represent many jobs, not one. So in our field in particular, there is not usually a one-to-one match between a job post and an open job. Oftentimes there is, but oftentimes there isn't. Why? This is due to the high number of contract companies in our field. So the way the contract companies work is they basically go out into the world and secure all these contracts. They'll secure school district contracts because the school district hasn't been able to find an SLP. So they'll swoop in and they'll say, hey, we'll find you an SLP. They get a contract in place. The contract company is like, all right, we need you paying us $70 per hour. And then they go out and they find an SLP who will work for like 55 or something like that. And so they take a cut off the top. Everybody's happy, whatever, whatever. Or sometimes everybody's not happy, but that's the way it works. And these contract companies often have many contracts at a time. They've got school districts, they've got medical setting contracts, right? And they have tons and tons and tons of open contracts, to the extent that a lot of times that even if they don't have an open contract, they know that they can get one. So like in the Kansas City metro area, where I live, a lot of the contract companies, they'll have a job post up for the KC Metro, saying, oh, we pay between $50,000 and $140,000 per year. But there isn't even an open contract yet. They haven't even secured one. They just know that they'll be able to at some point within the next several months within Kansas City. Okay. And so a lot of times these job posts represent a bunch of jobs all in one. So they'll make one job post to represent all of them. I call these like lead gen posts, and SLPs a lot of times will refer to these as like bait and switch jobs, because what'll happen is they'll apply for a job and then they don't find out what the setting is. They don't find out what the pay is. They don't find out what the hours are, nothing, until they're actually in the process of like active discussions with the contract company. And a lot of times they won't even disclose where they want to put you or where they could put you or if they have a job with you until you start to agree to wages. So a lot of times they're vetting you for how much you're willing to work for, and then they try to find a place to put you. And so the pay for these often are listed with really, really wide ranges, where an SLP will look at that and they'll be like, yeah, I'll work for something in that range. Like that range looks good to me, but like the job that they actually are placing you at might not actually have that range. The job that they're placing you at, their range might be like 55 to 70. So like that everything from 70 to 140 doesn't even exist for the job they end up putting you in. And pay transparency laws aren't capturing this at all yet. Like this is kind of one of those like tricky things that like nobody seems to know what to do about. Like the fact that like, yes, it's a job with this company, but it technically applies to about 50 potentially open positions that may or may not even be open yet. All right, so another thing that we're seeing a lot online, especially, is what are referred to as ghost jobs. And the Wikipedia description is really good on this. But a ghost job is basically a job post that doesn't exist. Or a job post for a job that doesn't exist. In our field, the reason you'll see these is for lead generation. Okay. So whoever's making a job post, they want something from you. They want your email because they're trying to build up an email list of SLPs emails. Okay. Um, or they, another reason that I see them is sometimes companies will make a job post without the intent to fill it because they're trying to create the illusion either to internal people or to investors that they like, are actively trying to fill positions and they're growing and stuff like that. And so sometimes it's not even for SLPs to click, it's for somebody else to look at and think a certain thing about their company. Most of the time they're lead gen though. Most of the time what the people who are posting these fake jobs that don't even exist want is they're wanting to build up an email list of SLPs or even a resume database of SLPs, and then they sell it to other companies. So they'll then go to another company and be like, hey, I've got a list of, 20,000 SLP emails and resumes. Do you want to buy it for me for, X dollars or whatever? And they sell it to them. And this is a problem in all fields, not just ours. And so I grabbed a couple of recent headings about or headlines about this, about how ghost jobs like are really, 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 really common. And not considering our field, but just considering the entire landscape. One of the major reasons they're really common, other than for like collecting people's emails and stuff like that, and then selling their emails, one of the reasons they're really common is because they're a great place to run scams because people disclose so much personal information during the job search process and when they think they're about to be hired in a position that doesn't even exist. So scammers can collect personal information from them and they're running scams that way. So just be aware that it like this kind of just like a side note that when you're on the job market, like don't disclose any information about yourself like whatsoever unless you have enough information to know that the job that you're applying to is real. Okay, so job post pay norms, kind of long story short, you can get some information about pay from jobs boards, but you need to be careful to assume that jobs boards represent normal or average or even real. To find good norms, the only reliable wage data you really should be looking at is ASHA's. Okay, so ASHA's, it won't steer you wrong. It's good data. The BLS data you can use, but cautiously and only if you understand it. Like, so for example, remember how I talked about, like, basically you just need to understand that both hourly and annual are dumping in there and when it's going to be really wrong. Like the schools data is pretty accurate, but any setting where it's like 50-50 salaried versus pay per visit, that data is going to be especially wrong. And so you can use it to kind of inform things a little bit. You can also use the BLS data to look at differences across states and things like that, because that tends to like kind of flesh out reasonably. But I would use it very, very cautiously because of the reason I described to you. And then as far as like job posts and pay, so where are we like right now in this country with pay transparency? So this is a screenshot from an HR lecture that I was in about 2 weeks ago from HR professional. And she was going through and updating all of us on all the different state laws. All the ones with green checks are current states with pay transparency laws where if you're hiring in that state, you have to legally disclose pay. All the ones with like a yellow squiggle that I put in there, those are all ones that are emergent, where there's laws kind of in the works and things are expected to change within the next year or so because of things that are in the works. And then all the ones that are blank have no laws related to it. And so pay transparency, like being required to post pay with a job post, is increasing a lot and it's becoming more and more normal, but it's still not really the norm. So another example from like Facebook, I went on again Facebook last week and just went into SLP groups and just started taking screenshots. And it took me longer to de-identify these than it took me to find the screenshots because the norm is that pay is never disclosed. So this is what a lot of the job posts will look like. The one on the left that's like, we're hiring, we're looking for a passionate SLP. So high competitive rate, productivity. I don't know what productivity as a bullet point means. I don't think the person who wrote that realizes that that's not actually like a selling point. PTO, pay for indirect time, holiday pay, 401k matching, and some of these things, like when you're on the job market and you start to realize like signals that signal W-2 versus 1099, you can start to kind of fill in gaps. Like for this one, for example, is that a W-2 or a 1099 role? The one on the left, the like we're hiring teal thing, W-2, exactly. We know it has to be W-2 because they have 401k matching, PTO. Those don't exist in 1099 roles. Like it can't legally exist. That's a W-2 job. And so like kind of some of those things where you can start to like fill in details about like all the things you'd need to know in order to know if it's, you know, a good fit for you or whatever can be in here, but rarely pay. Like pay is never in here. Like this one on the right, you know, lots of details about how many hours per week you're working and the fact that you're in an they have two openings, one elementary, one middle school. I love that because a lot of times setting isn't disclosed. $2,000 sign-on bonus. Love that too. That's cool, but they're still not telling you the pay range because it's just the norm not to. Most of our job posts look like this, where they say competitive pay, flexible schedules, work for the best company ever, rah rah. Okay. All right. So let's do a quick like learning check before we go into the other stuff. So things we've talked about so far. We know what to consider for 1099 versus W-2 and that there's pay calculations or pay implications. We also know where to find pay norms. So if you're trying to go look at, you know, what's normal pay, you can use ASHA's data, most reliable, and then just be aware of what could possibly go wrong with other data sources, including jobs boards, because they tend to be artificially high, BLS data, because it assumes everybody is paid 40 hours per week, and they're not, and social media. And to be honest, like I really like sometimes social media is the best source right now. Like it sounds silly to get on Facebook and be like, "Hey, I'm thinking about moving back home to Utah and I want to work in the schools. What are you all making in the Utah schools or whatever?" Or I'm thinking about moving to Texas and I'm a Med SLP. What are Med SLPs making down there? And you know, you can get bad information that way because usually, you know, you'll get 10, 20, 30 people's responses and you don't know where they're coming from. You don't know if they're giving you like hourly or annual wages. You don't know if like what they're telling you is a little off or not. But sometimes it's more, it frankly is more right than the BLS data. Usually, like the phone a friend technique where you ask 10 or 20 random SLPs is better than the BLS data if you don't understand what's wrong with it. So anyhow, so how should we go about calculating pay when so that we can choose good jobs and self-advocate? So let's talk about that next. How to calculate take-home pay. So I developed a pay calculator last year, and I'll bring that over. It's linked from Informed Jobs website. Hold tight, I've got a whole bunch of open tabs. So I'll just show you like where it's linked from. So on the Informed Jobs website, we have this whole career advice page that has tons and tons of stuff. Like there's that 1099 W-2 thing I was talking about. There's information about pay norms, how to know if a job has good pay. So like the pay calculator is linked from within this article. So all this stuff is findable. But what the pay calculator looks like is this, and I'll show you how it works. Okay, so you just click start and then you start to fill in your information. So, and it adapts based on what you put in it. So like if you put in annual, see how you can kind of see like things start to change down there a little bit. And if you put in annual like W-2 versus 1099, see how the questions like down below are changing based on what I put. It changes with everything that you enter. Okay. So like you can say, all right, annual, or here, let's make it more exciting. Well, yeah, sure, we can do the annual one. Annual W-2. How many hours do you anticipate working in a year? The default is 2080 because it has to be. But every single one of these, there's like a click to get help situation where it goes through and explains to you. So it says, you know, SLP is unique. Most of us aren't paid 2080 hours. Then it kind of goes through and gives you like common examples. Like a 9-month school job usually has 15, 20 work hours per year. And it basically explains, you know, how you'd calculate it for part-time, how you'd calculate it for full-time and what all that means. That way, when you look at a question like this, because most SLPs will look at a question like this and be like, wow, I've never been asked that before, but this number has to be right in order for you to calculate your pay. Okay. And so the same thing goes for all of these fields. Did I get not 800? That'd be nice. Next one. So like add the value of your health insurance benefit. Most people are like, the value of my health insurance benefit. I don't know how to do that. And so click help and it will describe to you. It will say the average value of employer sponsored health insurance for 2023 is $7,000. For a family of four, it could be more like 20 grand. If you're an individual in your early 20s, it could be more like $2,700. So at the top, it kind of gives you like quick benchmarks to put in to get pretty close to it for yourself based on national averages for what employer sponsored health insurance plans tend to cover. And then down below, it gives the whole like explanation for like links out that you would need to click and things to consider if you want to get even more specific than that. But just knowing, for example, that like the average value for kind of the average person is 7 grand is a whole lot better than not accounting for it at all when you're on the job market. Okay. Um, and so I'm just going to put in fake numbers so we can keep going. So you see the deal. Like basically, like for each field, you have to put in numbers. If you have no idea what it means, it's cool. We have explanatory documents for you, blah, blah, blah. What's your tax bracket? Again, a lot of people don't know that. 22 would make sense for SLPs, but it gives you help if you, and then you hit calculate. And so what it does is it translates everything from between hourly and annual. So at the top, it says, okay, so your annual rate is 80 grand. That would make your hourly rate 38.46. The hourly value estimate is the amount of money you'll make after like taxes adjusted for the value of your benefits, annual value estimate, and so on. And then disclaimers about how like it's not taking into account state and local taxes because we don't have all that in there. And then you can kind of go through over and over again and like recalculate it. It works. It's really, really, really helpful for hourly roles to get to kind of an annual estimate for what you'll be making. So that exists. So one option is to use that pay calculator that we built. Or you can use any other pay calculator online. But I do want to make sure to emphasize three things. This bolded one is your expected hours and contract details that impact pay is by far the biggest. It's the thing for SLPs that matters the most that's missing for any other pay calculator. So you can like get on the internet and be like, I need a pay calculator to calculate my take home pay or whatever. And this is going to be a big thing for us. So I'll describe that in the upcoming slides. But just also make sure that it's asking you 1099 versus W-2. Make sure that it's taking into account the value of benefits because a lot of people kind of forget this. Like they'll take a job with no benefits because the annual pay is higher, not thinking about how expensive it's going to be to pay out of pocket for their own health care, especially if they like start to build a family and stuff like that. And so I think it's important that you're always like considering that those things have value. And then you'll compare that to national and local norms like the ASHA data. The norms will vary primarily by local cost of living. And SLP wages vary a lot by local cost of living. Like there's some states where it's normal for SLPs to make 55,000. There's some states where it's normal for SLPs to make over 100,000. And I see a lot of people having conversations online about pay and never disclosing where they live. And it just kills me because somebody will get on the internet and be like, I just got a job offer for 70 grand. Like, is this good? And then you'll see all these people be like, that's horrible. That's horrible. I make over 6 figures. I make over 6 figures, you know? And that person's sitting there like, what am I doing wrong? I can't find a job that's paying me that much. And it's like, well, yeah, because you live in Arkansas, you know, like this person commenting lives in New York City. Like, and they need to be telling you that because it's messing everybody up. So always, always, always consider local cost of living because the number one thing that will vary is where you live. Work setting is the second thing that things will vary the most by. Like you SNF SLPs tend to make more than preschool SLPs, for example. And then your years of experience is kind of the third thing that is going to affect how much you're paid. So a brand new SLP is going to make less money than somebody who's worked 10 years, for example. Okay. Expected hours and contract details. Because like this is pretty easy, right? It's like, okay, so I got to go to a pay calculator. I got to make sure that the pay calculator knows 1099 versus W-2 differences. You don't need to do that math yourself. There's a million pay calculators online that do it just like ours. Benefits, again, you usually don't have to like be super informed on like the value of most 401k plans because the pay calculators will ask you questions and kind of guide you. This one is the one that screws everybody up, the expected hours and contract details. Okay, so let's talk about that. Um, okay, so salary. Most people's jobs are salaried. So most people, when you talk to them about pay and you say something like, "Oh, how much are you making?" They'll say, "Oh, I'm making $80,000 a year." "Oh, how much are you making?" "I'm making $60,000 a year." Cool, cool, cool. And that used to be how it was for SLPs. Like SLPs used to talk to each other in annual terms. But I've been really surprised at the shift that has happened over the last decade, where SLPs all tend to talk to each other in annual hours more often now. Like, what are you paid per hour? Oh, I'm paid 50. Oh, negotiated up to 70 or whatever the case may be. Um, Salaries really easy. Like knowing what you're going to make in a year when you're salaried, like they're the only thing you need to adjust for is maybe 1099 versus W-2, right? Hourly is infrequently easy because usually those hourly roles are actually pay per visit roles. So let's go through each. What I mean by hourly is I mean like um, it only is a true hourly job if your hours are guaranteed. And if your hours are not guaranteed, it's not an hourly job, it's a pay per visit job. Okay. So, like, what I mean by that is like, say the place that you work wants you for 20 hours a week. And what you need to know is that 20 hours a week like what you're trying to get me to with the caseload and you're trying to get me around 20 hours per week? Or am I paid for 20 hours per week no matter what happens? Because there's a big difference between yes, we can, pay you for 20 hours every single week, every week of the year, no matter what, versus if census is low, you'll actually be paid for only like 7 visits, 7 hours or whatever, right? So it's only hourly if your hours are guaranteed. If your hours are guaranteed, it's easy to calculate. These pay per visit roles are atrocious though. And I'm going to teach you like the only trick that I've found to figuring out what you're going to make with them. Um, the most reliable information you'll get if you're wanting to take a pay per visit role is to ask the employer this one magic question. And so like if there's anything like that like you take from this lecture, honestly, I would want it to probably be this. Do not take a pay per visit role without asking the employer, "Hey, what's the range and the average annual pay for the current SLPs working for you that have this job?" Nothing else will tell you any better information than that. Because what you want to get from them is for them to disclose that and say something to you like, "Oh, okay. So like the range of what our SLPs are making in this pay per visit role per year, always ask per year, always, is, between 65,000 and 90,000. And on average, most of the SLPs are usually making around 70 in this role." Then you can take that information and make a good choice for yourself because you can be like, "Okay, cool. So I know that I could probably expect about 70. It could be as low as 65. Decide if you're cool with that, decide if the range makes sense for you, and then you can proceed." Um, all employers are capable of disclosing this and they know these numbers. There is no such thing as a business owner that's like, "I don't know what I paid all my SLPs last year." Of course they do. They're running payroll like every 2 weeks, every month, they are clicking pay in their system, paying their SLPs. It takes them 2 seconds to get that information. And that information tells you so, so, so much more than asking any other question. And I'll kind of explain why. But just always ask them that. Just ask them that. And any employer who is not willing to tell you that, you do not want to be working for. Like if they're not willing to tell you the range, and the average, and sometimes, like if you want to go a little bit further with it, some of the follow up questions you can ask are like, "Well, you know, I don't want to get myself into a situation where I'm making less than $50,000 per year. Could that happen in this job?" And have that conversation with them, and they'll be able to tell you, like, "Oh, we have a wait list a mile long. Like, the only way you're not making that is if you, for some reason, aren't able to like work, most of the time or whatever." And just kind of like get that what if thing in place because those what if situations are what a lot of SLPs how they get themselves into bad jobs. And a lot of times, like, I'll see these conversations play out, like, for example, like on SLP Reddit, where you'll see like a young SLP and they'll be like, "I can't survive on these SLP wages. Like, I can't pay for rent. I can't afford groceries. I can't do anything. How are you guys making this work? Are you all just like married to someone who has a really good job or something and they just can't figure out why they can't make it work?" And so people will say to them like, "Oh, what are you making per hour?" And they'll say, "Well, I'm making $50 per hour." And then somebody else will be like, That's normal. Like that's normal. $50 per hour is normal. So like they don't even know what to say to the person. So they're like, I don't know why you can't afford rent because I can afford rent making $50 per hour or whatever, even if they live in the same city. But it comes down to like what the job actually looks like that they're working in. Because some people can be on a contract that's $50 per hour making 40 grand. And other people can be on a contract that's $50 per hour and they're making over six figures. So that's why you have to ask that question for that pay per visit job because they vary by too many factors. So some of the factors that it varies by is session duration. Like that's never disclosed. So it'll be like, here's the pay per visit rate. And it's like, well, okay, so like, are most of your sessions 30 minutes? Are most of them 45 minutes or most of an hour? Do you have to travel between sessions? Like what's going on with like the time scale here? Because nobody ever seems to disclose that in job posts. Pay per task type. So what's meant by that is like indirect versus direct time. So you'll see all sorts of funky things where some jobs pay for direct and not indirect time. So remember that indirect time is like writing reports, planning for therapy, calling parents, sending emails, preparing for the next therapy session, all that type of stuff. You'll see jobs where they pay like $10 per hour for indirect time. Um, the other things that tend to like cause a lot of variation is things like cancellation policies. So whether or not an SLP is paid for cancellations and what the true policy even really looks like. Like, are you paid if the parent cancels at the last minute within the last 24 to 48 hours, but you're not paid if they cancel like 2 days in advance? Like all those little things matter so much because all those little things end up impacting what your day looks like. Even norms, I've noticed like norms for indirect time because at some workplaces, they have systems in place that you can actually write a lot of your session notes during the session, or the caseload allows you to write session notes during the session. And so you don't have as much like paperwork and notes that you have to do after each therapy session. Others, it's not like that. And they might have really, they expect a certain level of like data collection or a certain level of like reporting on the sessions that is pretty intense. And so your employer is putting in place things where they expecting you to have a lot of indirect time. So like that can be really different too. At one private practice, the norm might be for all the SLPs to be spending over only an hour per week on like paperwork and report writing and progress notes and data stuff. And then at another private practice, they might want you doing like 4 hours a week, 5 hours a week of that. And those little differences make a big difference in your pay. There's also funky things like productivity bonuses. Like a lot of times pay per visit roles will like pay you per visit. And then if you see a lot of clients, they pay you more. And the math is just really, really, really difficult. And so at Informed Jobs, we actually so we've been processing jobs since mid-December because we were testing with employers for the last 2 weeks of December and then formally launched our website at the beginning of January. I genuinely thought that for pay per visit roles, we would be able to build a survey that asks them all these questions. What's your pay for indirect? What's your average rate of cancellations? What's your pay for direct? What's your average session duration? What's the range of session duration? And I thought that if we got all these numbers input in here, we could calculate true hourly pay and true annual pay for these pay per visit roles. And we tried, but it actually isn't working very well because of how variable all this stuff is. And because it's almost like you can't even get like a real solid answer that's anything any more reliable than this question. And so we're actually about to make a change to our website next week where we're going to change how we're quizzing related to these PPV jobs. And we aren't letting anyone into the database at all unless they disclose this, period. Because what we're finding is it's the most accurate. Like we can ask them all these questions about cancellation rate and indirect time and paperwork time and blah, 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 blah. The only thing that really tells us what the SLP is going to make is that. And that's a simple question for you guys to ask too when you're on the job market. Cool. Okay. How do you guys feel about this? So I saw this in one of the Facebook groups where a CF was excited about taking this job, and this is what it looked like with the pay. Like, do you all feel like you could like calculate the pay for her or like know what to tell her about if it's good or anything like that? Trying to figure out where I got my stuff. Or what would you tell her to ask the employer? Yeah. Asking what the average no-show rate for the company is would be good. What did I tell you in the last slide was the one thing that's the only thing that we found that seems to be reliable for these kind of roles. Like the one magic question that if you ask the employer, you're actually going to know what you're going to make. Yeah, cancellations would definitely matter.
Is it what's the range in average annual pay for current
Yes,
SLPs?
exactly. Like I process these job posts all the time. I've been working on like how to make this easier for SLPs for a year and a half. And it is the only thing, it's the only thing that tells you anything about what you're going to be paid. So what this SLP should be encouraged to do is say, like, that could be good, or it might not be good. It's actually impossible to tell. It's impossible to tell. So go to the employer, just write them a nice email, be like, I loved the visit at your clinic. Like this is like exactly the kind of job that I'm interested in. I'm really excited to work for you, but I need more information about pay. Could you tell me what the annual pay is for your current SLPs, both the range, like the low and the high, and the average, so that I can predict what I'm going to make in a year? And like, there's such nice ways to say it. You know what I mean? Where all you've got to say is like, I just need to be able to estimate what I'm going to make in a year. And I've had to explain this to employers where we come back to them and we're like, no, you have to tell us this. And the way that I had an email with an employer like 2 days ago where I was like, think of it like this. Like these job posts, the data that you're giving us, the SLP could be making less than 40K or over six figures. And I look at these job posts all the time and I can't tell what it is. And an SLP can't tell either. They just need to know like approximately how much are they going to make because they don't want to take a job that they're making, not enough. And they want to know which jobs where they could make really good money. And the employer's like, oh, I never thought about it that way. And I'm like, dude, yes. Like, yes. So that's just the magic question. That's it. Like asking about cancellations, asking about no-show policies, asking all that stuff is really informative. But I'm telling you, by far, the most important thing is the range and average. And then you'll be good to go. Okay. So it doesn't have to involve complex math. You just have to know when you need to ask it. And you need to ask it anytime the job post looks like this. Okay. Um, Again, because like this is really normal in our field. Like SLPs are making posts that look like this all the time. Like, hey, I need help deciding between two offers. One is pay per visit and one's salary. The salary one, I know what I'm making. The pay per visit one looks like this: 75 for treatment, 70 for supervision, 100 for evaluation, blah, 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 blah. Like, and SLPs, like sometimes they'll chime in and like give opinions and stuff, but like really this person just needs to be told, like ask that home health employer, ask them what the range is annually for their current SLPs and ask them what the average is annually for the current SLPs. Because it's just impossible to calculate. It's truly impossible to calculate otherwise. Um, and then that second screenshot where another post, somebody said, I signed on for 56,000 as a salaried employee and then was told in December the company is no longer offering salary and that I would now be switched to hourly. It's not really hourly, it's pay per visit because pay is $35 per hour for treatment and $8 per hour for non-billable time. I'm a CF in a suburb of a large city. Thoughts? And like, companies will pay you a salary when they can. And a lot of times when they're doing these pay per visit things, it's because they're protecting their own butts to make sure that if they don't have the money coming in to pay you, that you don't have to be paid. And that's why you'll see companies sometimes even make that switch from salary over to pay per visit. Why? Because it's better for them. It removes their risk and puts the risk on your lap. Okay. So just be careful with those. Some of the best jobs I've seen are pay per visit. Pay per visit are not bad. But the bad ones are almost all PPV. So taking a pay-per-visit job, it doesn't mean it's going to be a bad job, but if you're going to find a bad job, a lot of times they're pay-per-visit when it comes to pay, when it comes to not making what you think you're going to make. Okay. Dana said some online companies put guaranteed 0 to 40 hours. Oh, that's cute. Okay. So kind of like some like, bringing it all home stuff. So at this point in time, when I talk about this topic, a lot of times like people can get overwhelmed and be like, "Ugh, should I just be looking for W-2 salary jobs only to make this all easier on myself?" And like, that's an option. Like if you want the protection of being an employee, if you want, for example, to not have to carry your own professional liability insurance, if you want to not have to worry about like figuring out what it means to be 1099, if you want the like legal protections of like, being an employee, and if you want guaranteed annual wages where, you signed a contract for 70 grand and you're going to make 70 grand no matter what, like that is a reasonable path to take because there's a lot more safety and security in W-2 salary jobs. But if you're able to start to understand how a lot of these 1099 jobs really work, sometimes you can make a lot more money in them. Okay. So I put another sort of like range thing where like just kind of schematically holding this in your head. Um, these jobs where you're a W-2 versus a 1099 where a staffing company owns the contract or a 1099 where you own the contract, they can all pay the same. Like, but what tends to happen is the W-2 jobs tend to pay more than the 1099 where a staffing company owns the contract. And if you own the contract, that's when you can start to make real good money. Like I know some SLPs that contract directly with school districts where there's no middleman. It's a contract between them as a solo private practice owner and the schools, and they are making fantastic freaking money because the whole reason the school district has a contract in place rather than just hiring an employee is because they've tried to hire an employee and it hasn't worked out. And so they're kind of in a bind because it's only 6 months away and the school year is going to start and they don't have enough SLPs. So they're like, we'll pay you whatever we need to pay you. And they'll like sign a contract with the SLP where she's making $140,000 per year. And she's like, yay, that's what I wanted. And so you can make really good money if you know how to do that. It's not easy to learn how to do that, but there's a lot of resources for SLPs online related. So if you even just kind of Google like how to secure my own school contract as an SLP, there's multiple people who have like courses and stuff on that type of stuff. Um, and then remember the difference between like being a 1099 where a staffing company owns the contract and being a 1099 where you own it is just whether or not somebody else is doing all the legwork of going out to secure the contract, negotiate the contract, and putting you on it versus you owning the contract in the first place. So when somebody else owns it, they're going to take a piece off the top. Now, some people will kind of like get in their head about this and be like, that's terrible. Like, why would they do that? Like, I don't want a middleman. Like, I hate these middlemen. They're all like taking the top off of like all of our wages, But do keep in mind that they're getting paid for their job, which is to go out and find those contracts and have all those meetings and negotiate the contracts and pay for legal because you usually don't want to enter a contract with anybody unless you've had an attorney look over it and the attorney costs money. You know what I mean? And so it's not that they're unfairly taking money off the top. It's that they're doing all those things that if you secure the contract yourself, you'll be having to do all that labor, all that legwork, taking on all that risk, that type of thing. So, you know, and also there are staffing companies out there who have W-2 roles, and those are often really good. So some staffing companies actually make you an employee of their staffing company rather than it being like um, passing on the contract to you. So that's kind of just like the difference between them if you're kind of weighing pros and cons. So we're going to start to talk about like solutions. I've given you kind of some solutions already to some of the things that you'll encounter. But I wanted to make sure because like a lot of times when I talk about stuff, people get terrified of being a 1099, but there's a lot of pros of being a 1099. You just have to know what you're doing and you have to understand how it's different. So like here's somebody on social media who's talking about being a 1099 for over a decade and they love it. They're setting their own hours. They don't have to ask for time off because they understand that they're their own boss. So they're taking an advantage of those perks, right? And they're like, the taxes are fine if you follow the rules and pay quarterly. I have my own health insurance and retirement accounts because she's basically figured out how to set them up. And so you just need to like know the difference so that you can, if you decide to take the 1099 path instead of W-2, you know what you're getting yourself into and can take advantage of some of the perks essentially. Um, Other solution, again, if pay matters for you, don't apply for a job without attempting to calculate pay, specifically annual pay. Hourly pay means absolutely nothing. Like discussions around hourly pay are just nonsense words because they don't line up with what you're actually taking home in a year. So I would encourage SLPs to like so to not only, use a pay calculator and understand the difference between 1099 and W-2 and understand like expected hours and contract details, but really like I'm kind of wishing that I would have just made this slide instead. Don't take a job without understanding annual pay because that's really the actual take home. Like the actual take home is we need to go back to talking about annual pay, not hourly. Another like little quick story. So the informed SLP staff, we use Slack to communicate. So because all of us work in different areas of the country and some people work or live internationally and stuff. But there about a year ago or so, like when I was first planning the informed jobs database, I was trying to figure out if we should be representing pay by default as hourly or annual. And like in my mind, I was like, why would you ever represent pay as hourly? We need to be representing it as annual. And so but I started to have conversation with the SLPs who work with us, and was asking them, like, how do you all think about pay? And most of them were saying hourly. They would be like, oh, I always think about pay as hourly. I think about, like I've got this job where I make 40 per hour. I also have this PRN role where I make 80 per hour, blah, blah, blah. And then I asked a couple of them, I was like, well, what are you making annually for like the 40 versus the 80? And these are smart people. Like these are smart people that read research articles for a living. And two of them were like, I don't know. I was like, you don't know? Like you don't like this job versus this job, you've never actually calculated how much you're taking home per year? And they're like, no. And I'm like, what? Like, this is how we're getting real screwed up. And this is how SLPs are saying things like, the pay is horrible. I can't afford my bills. Like, this isn't working for me. Well, yeah, because like you're not actually paying attention to what you're really making. You know what I mean? Like, I could ask you, are you making 70K per year, more or less? And a lot of people are like, I don't know. I just know I make 50 per hour. Like, that's not going to work. Everything has to be an annual. Okay, so or you can use informed jobs because once I started really digging in, I figured out, how to kind of like represent pay a little bit more easily for people. Okay, so I've been mentioning informed jobs like little bits and pieces this whole time. But basically what it is it's a jobs database. So when you come to the homepage, it looks like this. Let me bring over a link to the website. Oh, I have so many links open over here right now. Can bring over a new tab, and then we'll just go to the homepage. So when you land on it, it looks like this. And really, I just wanted to build a jobs database where SLPs could actually tell what they were getting themselves into because I was just getting so frustrated with people like, not being able to figure out like how to navigate the fact that employers are withholding this information most of the time. So the main function of informed jobs is just to be able to find a job. And so the way we have it set up is we ended up landing on pay structured like this, where everything has hourly pay, annual pay, and informed pay, which I'll describe here in a second. And as you scroll down, whether or not it leads with hourly or leads with annual is based on what the contract looks like. So like if the contract leads with hourly, we lead with hourly. If the contract is annual, we lead with annual. But and so like with the hourly pay, you'll see like the hourly pay and then the annual estimate based on that, or the annual pay with the hourly estimate based on that. And we basically are doing all these conversions for you. Okay. That way, when you're scrolling through, you can actually see realistically what pay looks like. And that way annual is never missing. Because that was one of my big goals, is I was like, we can't keep having these job posts where annual pay is missing. And then informed pay is a totally different thing. So if you hover on this icon, it describes it. And you can like click out to read this article that shows you like exactly all the math that goes into it. But basically, I wanted for people to be able to scroll through our database and look at one number and compare jobs directly to each other. And so what this is it's a calculation that I built with an accountant in order to put W-2 and 1099 roles on the exact same scale. So that the pay calculator that I showed you how to use, and how I talked to you about how, like, if you're 1099, you're paying 7.65% more in taxes out of your pocket. So you need to account for that. Like, I started to realize, I was like, people shouldn't have to do that. Like, people just shouldn't have to do math. And so if we put something in place that allows everything to be directly compared to each other, which is what informed pay is, it allows you to basically scroll through and see what like the real pay looks like. And then, so in addition to pay, like, pay is one of my like personal sticking points that's really important to me. But we do a lot of other things too. All of these job posts are standardized, where the question that we ask people is identical across every single job post, because I don't want employers to insert sales language in here. I want them to just tell you all these things. And so every job post is filled out with a survey and laid out the exact same way. We don't allow people to not disclose every single one of these things. And so like there's one job post, but like if you read the next one and expand it, see how it's all this exact same format? And it's so that you can compare jobs directly to each other. Like you compare them directly on pay, you can compare them directly on benefits, and like things are kind of grouped in ways that make sense. Like the benefits, stipends, and reimbursements are all next to each other. And like we try to like educate people as much as possible. Like stipends are taxed and reimbursements are untaxed. Even little things like schedule. Matters a lot. Like I quit an SLP job one time because the schedule didn't work for me, because I had infant twins at the time. And they told me that I would only sometimes need to be there really early in the morning. And they ended up having me really early in the morning all the time. And I didn't have childcare early in the morning. And I had to quit the job after 30 days purely because the schedule didn't align with my childcare, you know? And so there's like little things like that that we just believe SLPs should know and should just by default be disclosed 100% of the time. Um, and then if you look at our filters, it also shows you what you can filter by. So like we have clinical and non-clinical jobs. SLPAs and university jobs will be coming later. You can filter by W-2 versus 1099. So if you're somebody who's like, I really only want a W-2 role, you can do that. If you only want full-time roles, you can, click that. You can put in pay numbers based on hourly, annual, or informed pay, just depending on what you like to search by. Notice that we have like setting filters with which non-SLP jobs databases don't have. Work location. So if you're like, I really only want to switch jobs if I can get a fully remote job in this state. And so you can click that and then filter by state. And then some of the features, like the features are one of the things that I'm most proud of, because if you really dig into these, you start to figure out how valuable they are. Because for example, like some people don't have their C's and they might want to know how many jobs don't require C's. That's pretty important. Or some of you might be bilingual and you're like, I want to take advantage of this. I want to know who's actually going to pay me, for being bilingual. Some people are planning on having kids in upcoming years and they want to only see jobs where there's paid parental leave. Like all these things, guaranteed hours makes a difference. Health insurance makes a difference for people. But like in most jobs databases, they just don't have a way to search by those things, And so we're going to be building up these features over time based on feedback from SLPs about what they want to be able to filter by in order to find better jobs. So essentially, it's just a jobs database with a whole lot more information that's standardized and shows you what the pay is really going to be for any given job. And then we have this career advice page that has articles like I showed you, but it's free for SLPs. It's permanently free for SLPs. Like we have no intention of ever charging SLPs. It's employers who have to pay to post with us. If any employers happen to be here, it's actually free to post jobs still right now through February 17th, and then we'll turn the paywall on. So if you want to try it, you can. But that's what that is. So compared to other jobs boards, it's just really high detail because we're asking the employers a lot of questions. We also are running all the pay calculations for you so that you don't have to make any of those adjustments by hand. We're just doing them. Another difference is we're actually blocking all jobs below the 10th percentile, and based on 5 data sources. So like I told you, ASHA's is the strongest. We're also using the cost of living index to adjust by city. We're using calculations that we established with CPAs in order to be able to adjust all of this by 1099 versus W-2. We are lightly using the BLS data, but understanding what's wrong with it. So it's kind of just like an alt source. We're also using our own data, which is emerging. And basically, if 3 of these sources indicate that the job is below the 10th percentile, we reject it from the database because we just don't, because we want to. Because we want to and we're allowed to. But so our data that's emerging is one of the other kind of like side things that we're trying to do with Informed Jobs is collect SLP wage data. Because even though ASHA's is really well done, it's usually only around 1,200 data points. So like if you look, and it varies a little bit per year. So remember how they have like healthcare and school-based and they go every other year. If you look at the total number of SLPs data that they're considering for each of those surveys, the healthcare ones are pretty low. The school ones are a little bit high, but it's usually around 1,000 people or so. And ultimately, that's just not enough. So we're also collecting SLP wage data. And so if you click this hyperlink, that it will take you to our wage data survey, which is also kind of looks like this. It's also linked from the career resource page on Informed SLP. But we are like, first of all, making sure that people understand the difference between all these things. And then people go through and basically like click all these things that apply to them, insert all this information. We have a lot of like checks in place that like, if you don't know if you're 1099 or W-2, like do not pass go. We don't want your data. Go back and ask your employer because it'll mess up our data. And then goes through and asks them a bunch of questions about how they're paid. And then we have a partnership with another PhD who is analyzing all this data for us. And she just got started about a week ago. We have over 700 data points so far internally, but my goal is to get to 10,000 data points by the end of 2025 if we can. We haven't pushed hard yet on social media, but in the near future, once we analyze those 700 data points and I have it available on the website so that SLPs can go see what we have, I want to be able to use that to say, okay, so you see how we're going to display this data, you see what graphs we're going to share with you, and I hope that that incentivizes SLPs to be willing to enter their wage data, because that's the kind of data that we need to really be able to finally understand like how SLPs are being paid and what the true norms are. Okay. So a couple final thoughts before we start going through everybody's questions and stuff like that. A lot of times people will feel like low detail job posts or low pay are because people are evil. Like they're like, oh, those people that you're blocking that are below the 10th percentile, those must be the nasty, evil ones that are greedy, you know? And like the longer I've been doing this type of work, like it reminds me of this meme where employers are like, it's Medicaid's fault, it's the states. And SLPs are like, it's those greedy employers, it's the employers. And everybody's like pointing at each other saying it's everyone else's fault. Because ultimately, the way SLPs are paid, there's a lot of reasons why we're paid the way we are, that a lot of times we don't even deeply understand, and that even I over time am starting to like gradually understand more and more, and that most SLPs don't know. So some examples of that are like, I don't know if you all knew that insurance reimbursement rates for a lot of insurances in a lot of states are going down. So like if you work in a private practice and you were paid this amount last year, like, and you're still being paid that much and your employer hasn't dropped what they're paying you, they might be in a position where they're starting to lose money at this point in time because the insurance reimbursement rates went down. Same things going on with Medicaid, where like the rates, which ones are going up and which ones have flatlined for like 10 years and which ones are decreasing is all over the place. A lot of times people also don't understand that like it varies a lot from state to state. So like in Texas's Medicaid reimbursement rates are excellent. And so if you want to get paid real well, go to Texas. Florida's reimbursement rates are atrocious. If you want to find a bad job, just Google Florida SLP job. But it's not because the people in Florida are evil and the people in Texas are nice. It's because of the reimbursement rates that they have no control over. So you've got a lot of like, poor Florida. I don't know if any of you live in Florida. I'm sure you'll be able to find a good job there. Maybe you'll be able to work for a private practice that hasn't figured it out. Some of them have figured it out. But like what's essentially happening is these like private practice owners are like, well, my grad school friend who lives in Tennessee set up her private practice this way. I should be able to set up my private practice that way and make good money the way she's making good money. But it doesn't work that way because what's happening in the various states is all so different that in some states, like you can't plug and play the private practice game in the way you can in another state and actually make enough to be able to survive. So you have to be really strategic as a business owner in order to understand how to make enough money to make it work. And there almost always is a way to make it work. But for some people, it's easy because of where they live. And some people, it's hard because of where they live. And so I genuinely feel really bad for some of the people that get rejected from our database. And like just the other day, somebody was like, said to me something along the lines of like, I'm an SLP. Like I would never underpay SLPs. And there's nobody who wants to pay SLPs more than I do, you know? And it's just like, because it's like, I know, but like we've made a policy that we're not going to put on SLP's laps the problems of the system. And, you know, business owners really need to figure out how to navigate the system in order to not get themselves into a situation where they're offering $25 per hour to an SLP, because that's what I rejected the other day when that SLP was like, but I can't pay more. And I'm like, I'm so sorry, but you're gonna have to figure this out. So the cognitive shortcut, or like those employers must be evil and greedy, is something that usually just indicates that the system is misunderstood. And while it would be great if all SLPs deeply understood why they're paid what they're paid in different settings, with different business structures, with different, like whether or not it's private pay or Medicaid or insurance reimbursement or whatever, it's kind of a lot to expect SLPs to deeply understand that. It's really not their job. And so instead, as SLPs, we just have to know what's in our control and set our own thresholds and boundaries, and to just say to ourselves, like, this is what I want for myself, and this is what I'm okay with. And so I want a job that has these criteria, and that's just what I'm going to expect. And it doesn't have to be a situation where, you know, I see people like blast businesses on social media and stuff all the time. And I'm like, well, some of them are evil, but some of them also just haven't really figured it out, or living in a setting where it's just not working very well. So I'll skip this last one. We'll just go straight to questions and discussion because I know you guys have a lot of really good questions in the chat, and I want to make sure that we have time to talk about stuff. So any questions that have kind of come up, I also would be interested in, for you all, like if you feel totally comfortable and confident going forward with judging job offers, or if there's things that you thought you would learn about that you didn't, and I can speak to some of those things, or just other thoughts or questions that you have. And I know that Melissa was wanting to like stop the recording about this time too, just so that you all can ask questions without feeling like it's being recorded.